Hi, and welcome to the LANDIS Look, where we take an inside look at the world of real estate. And I'm Justin, here with my partner, Jarrod, today. Jarrod, how's it going?
It's going really well, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for doing this. Today, we're going to look at what is the easiest way to get your first rental property. There's a handful of ways you could do it, but you and I think there's one way that's easier than the others. What is the most common way, let me start with, not necessarily the easiest, what's the most common way to get a rental property?
Yeah, so the most common way is determine that you want that to be part of your long-term investment strategy, and then work hard, save money, try to get ideally 20, 25, even 30% of that down payment saved up, and then go out and buy a house just like you did your personal home.
Why do you need 20, 25, 30% down when a lot of people who are listening, if they bought a house, they probably bought their first house with 3.5% down or 5% down? Why'd you say such big numbers? Because if you're watching this and you think you need 20 or 30% down to buy your own personal residence, that is definitely not the case. But why'd you say that here?
Yeah, so for this, it's a riskier loan in the eyes of the bank. So you're much more likely, to keep your own house payment than you are a rental property. And also you have to find a tenant, things like that. So from the bank's perspective, not only do they want a good bit more money down, but they also charge you for that risk in the form of a higher interest rate as well.
Yeah, so you're putting all that money down and you're getting a higher rate. And so, this changes all the time. But I mean, right now, in a lot of cases, it's 30% down to get the best pricing on the investment property loans. Am I right on that?
That's right, yeah.
And so that means on a $200,000 house, that's 60 grand. There's a pretty sizable amount to save, right? So yeah, we're smiling. This is the most common way to get a rental property, but we think we know an easier way that a lot of y'all could do. What's the easier way to get a rental property?
The easier way to get a rental property, and I mean, this is a good 2, 3, 4 year strategy, is to buy your first home and then never sell it.
Yeah.
Live there for 2, 3, 4 years, build up some equity, and keep that owner occupant financing that we just talked about, that nice low interest rate, get in with less cash. And then when you decide to move up to your next house, just hold on to it, rent it out, and then move on to your next place.
What's the biggest reason people don't do this, though? There's one big reason that people don't do this.
Yeah, the big reason is the hurdle, I guess, would be that you have to save up enough money for your next down payment. And a lot of people think that they need the equity out of their first home in order to put down on their second home.
Yeah, and in some cases, it's not think that, they actually do need to be able to do it. So there's a little bit of strategy to this where it's like, hey, if I know this is going to be a strategy, over 4 or 5 years, I can potentially save a little bit extra to go to the down payment. And then if you're in the right cash flow situation, you could tap some of the equity in your current house without actually selling it, right?
Yes, absolutely. So if you bought well, if you put down a good amount of money or paid down over time, and if the market has appreciated, so the fair market value of your home has gone up, all those things can contribute to being able to what they call cash out or pull money out of your existing home. And you can use that for anything, but in this case, obviously we'd be using it as part of the down payment for your next home.
Yeah. So, for some folks who, we're fortunate enough to buy 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago, have a ton of equity now, you might refinance and take out a little bit of that equity, use that as a down payment, part of your down payment on your next house. But still, if your property rents for enough, you can still be cash flow positive on that first property and have the owner occupied financing on it.
Yeah, exactly.
What else is an advantage? Because we were talking, we think there's a couple of other advantages. What's another advantage of renting out the house that was your primary residence?
Yeah, there are really a few that I like. One is if you've lived in the home, then you know all the ins and outs. So you know what works, you know what doesn't work, you know how old the HVAC is, you know what actually needs to be repaired and what doesn't. And that's a really big value, as opposed to just buying one on the open market and then never living in it. You may never find out all the ins and outs of it.
Yeah, you definitely get to know those trouble spots because you're living there. Whereas, if you think about even buying, those of you who have bought a personal residence and not an investment property, pretty sure no matter how great the home inspector was, you got into the house and you're like, oh, I was surprised by this. I didn't know this. And that's not a knock on the home inspector. They're there for 2 or 3 hours. They're not living in the house for 3 years. But if you rent out your primary residence, you have lived there and you do know the spots, not necessarily that it's a problem, but things you know you need to watch or keep good maintenance on or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. And then another thing that I think is a really big value add is, you know, what's the oldest real estate saying is location, location, location. And you know the neighborhood. And so you have an in and out knowledge. And so you can make the determination, hey, I think this neighborhood's going to do really well over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. I want to hang on to it. As opposed to a lot of times when people come to us and they say, hey, I'd like to buy an investment property, it's usually not in the neighborhood where they already live. And so then they have to do a lot of research and get a comfort level with the neighborhood, maybe a little bit further out or in a different part of town than what they're used to.
Yeah, and you may already, just from living in the neighborhood, have firsthand info of like how are properties renting in the neighborhood and what the rents are. Whereas you're right, there's a complete new education point at another location. And then, you know, the final thing with that, if you do keep that very first financing, I know this may not seem like a huge amount of time, but if you're already 3 or 4 years into the amortization, you're 3 or 4 years away from getting that house paid off. And once the house is paid off, that's when you are in such a beautiful position here. This always reminds me when we talk about this. 2 of my good friends a couple years ago both sold their first houses and used that money to buy lake houses. And they did this, you know, I mean, they bought that first house and then they rented it and they bought other stuff. And, you know, 15 years go by when you're my age, just like that. And it's like, oh, I've got a humongous amount of equity in this first house that someone else paid for. And now I can parlay that in these cases with a 1031 exchange. That means they didn't pay taxes on their gain yet. They deferred the taxes into a lake house. Now that is a win in my book, is to take your first house, have someone else pay it down and end up with a lake house.
Yeah. For me, last year, my house, I did not do this, by the way. And last year, my first house came back on the market, and it came on the market just a little over twice of what I paid for it. So a significant amount of money. Now, that was over maybe 8 or 9 years, which, but to Justin's point, I mean, that may sound like a long time, but before, you know, it goes by fast. And yeah, that would be nice. That would be a nice addition to my net worth. Or would have been, I guess.
Would have been. It doesn't seem that long ago since you had that house. So, I mean, yeah, it doesn't seem that long ago. All right. So to recap today, I mean, yes, you can buy investment properties and we help a lot of people do that. And some of y'all, you know, the primary residence you have, it may or may not set up to be a good rental. And so there's an evaluation on that piece as well. But if you are in a primary residence where you're like, yeah, this would be a good rental property, there are some definite advantages of keeping it and buying your next house without actually selling that first house. And then there are some, like we said, a couple of things to consider. We're happy to walk you all through that in your own personal situation. Do what so many of you do. Send us a private message. We'll get with you and help you out with that. But Jarrod, I wish I had also kept my first house as well. I mean, it's more than 2x. There's more time has passed as well. But yeah, you and I would be in a much different situation had we kept those first houses. So don't make the same mistake we did. Keep that house, get a lake house from it in 15 years. And this is what we think one of the best ways to get a rental property. So thanks for watching, y'all. Thanks for being here, Jarrod.
Thank you.
All right. See you guys.